You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're watching the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com for all of those of you who don't know where to find that. And you can go there and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio and all the places where you can find this show and the different outlets where you can listen to it, like iTunes and Spreaker and iHeartRadio and other places. And there are links over there for that, or you can listen to the show there audibly. You can also come over to my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts to find this simulcast in video, as well as the live chat room filled with other Intrepids listening and discussing listening to and discussing this show and many other things. So come on over, make some friends over there, see what people are talking about, and enjoy the chat room. And at the same time, while you're there, you can find over 300 of these episodes archived down on the Intrepid Radio link at my YouTube page. Go right to the main page. It's the second one down from the top. It'll say Intrepid Radio. You can click on that and listen to all episodes. So also, if you're not already, subscribe over there and click on the little bell, and you'll get notifications of this show. It's airing and all the times where you can come over there and see it. So thanks for being here tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about something that I think I love: biblical history. Now, some people might say, well, I'm not a Christian or I'm not a Jew, so why should biblical history be of interest to me? Well, I think it's because, and those of you, by the way, who were raised Christian or Jewish, and either still are or once were, this is of great interest. While I have left certain tenets of the dogmatic, the literalist Orthodox Christianity, I still adhere to certain precepts and certain things that are laid out in the Bible's pages. Now, does that mean I agree with every little bit of its theology? No. But I found that the Bible is an incredibly accurate historical book. Now, when people say, well, the Bible's fake or the Bible's inaccurate or whatever they might say about it, you know, you can really say that about the theology. Because if you are not of that faith, that could seem like, well, why is that accurate? I don't believe that. You don't have to believe the theology to understand that the history in the Bible is I was going to say voracious, not voracious, efficacious. That's the word I'm looking for, is good. It's there, it's solid. And but I did want to look at a couple of things that might be sticking points for some people. And part of this is wrapped up in the question of part of what the title is for tonight's show, which is the God before the Hebrews. And so what was the religion? Who was the God that existed for people like, let's say, Abraham, the founder of, if you will, the father of the Jewish nation? He wasn't a Hebrew. He was Mesopotamian. He was Middle Eastern. He was Middle Eastern, not Mesopotamian. He was Middle Eastern. He was, I guess you could say Mesopotamian because he's up in the northern reaches of the Middle East. And so, what were these guys? Who did they worship? Who was the God that spoke to them? Why did people before them not have this same God that is so well defined? It seems in the books of Genesis, but written by Moses, who came after Abraham. And so I wanted to dig into this a little bit. And there is roots for biblical God worship in Mesopotamia. What, if anything, can we learn about the biblical religion from the vast quantities of material relating to Mesopotamian religion? And the answer is a great deal. No single volume provides better evidence for this conclusion than the recently published, and I want to say recently meaning in the last 50 years, okay? This was a book that was published about 40 years ago by an author who is no longer with us, no longer around. But there was a book by Thorkild Jacobsen, and it's called The Treasures of Darkness. It's a history of Mesopotamian religion. And this is a book, by the way, you can find. It was published by New Haven, Yale University Press in 1976. So 44 years ago is when that book came out. But Jacobsen is the revered master scholar of ancient Sumer and Assyria. And at age 75, when he published this book, he had an enormously fruitful and prolific scholarly life. And his book, Treasures of Darkness, is a really moving distillation of Jacobsen's sensitive understanding of Mesopotamian religion. But the book is not directed to a biblical audience, just like I would say John Ward's in my book, The Exodus Reality, which is nothing like Jorgensen's book on Mesopotamia, but an examination of a couple of theories on the historical Moses, while our book is something that is written about a biblical character. It is not necessarily written to a biblical audience, but it's written to an audience that would have an understanding of who this person was. The same thing with Jacobsen's book. He has not set out in his book to demonstrate what a study of Mesopotamian religion can teach us about biblical religion, although he did sometimes make references to similarities and parallels. His primary concern with what he wrote, and what I'm gleaning from tonight, is with the civilizations that he spent a lifetime studying. Yet the resonances are there. Much of ancient Mesopotamian religion is reflected, although in a perhaps refined form, in later Israelite religion. And in a sense, the Israelites can said to have taken the religious torch from early Mesopotamian religions. And to these, they of course added their own unique contribution. But many of the abstract attributes of the divine were already in place, developed in Sumerian and Assyrian civilizations of the 4th, 3rd, 2nd millennia BCE. Now remember when we talked about the Genesis story, when I talked about the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, and all of these characters. The Genesis story most pronounced the Garden of Eden story, which we hit on just a little bit yesterday in talking about Lilith and Eve. That story is a rewriting of a much earlier Mesopotamian story. That story of the Anunnaki gods creating humanity to do their work for them, and the king of the humans at that time cried out to his god, Enki, Ea, and asked him to come and deliver them from bondage to the gods. And Ea came up out of Ea, his other name, Ea's den, the serpent's den, the serpent's marsh that surrounded in the backwaters of the Euphrates River around the city of Eridu, where Atrahasis was the human king. And it was from these stories that we got the same story in the Garden of Eden story, just a little changed. Something Moses would have learned as a young man growing up in the school of the nobles when he was a younger man in Egypt. And he would have learned all of these stories and all of these events. And he took that story and he brought it up into Judaism when he codified Judaism. So the question is this a prototype story that he took it from and just changed some of the events? Was there a proto-religion that existed at the time? But you'll notice that when you study into some of these religious materials in Mesopotamia, you're going to see the similarities, but you're going to find that they are very different. But that this is where we got the names. This is where we got the attributes. This is where we got the characters of God. And so in 1980, Jacobson, the guy who wrote this book, was the recipient of the prestigious George Foot Moore Award, conferred at the Gala Centennial Celebration of the Society for Biblical Literature. And so why was a Sumerologist, Sumer being one of the major cities in Mesopotamia, Sumerologist and Assyriologist, why was he getting an award from the Society for Biblical Literature? The citation accompanying the award recognized that Jacobson's area of major concentration has been outside biblical scholarship. Nevertheless, the citation continued, he has brought immense riches and value to the field of biblical research. In his book, Treasures of Darkness, he makes these immense riches, at least as they relate to Mesopotamian religion, available in a popular and an understandable format. Now, Jacobson traces 3 major stages in the development of Mesopotamian religion, corresponding, conveniently enough, to the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd millennia BCE. Each of these 3 stages reflects a different social and political milieu, which in turn resulted in different religious orientation. So the earliest Mesopotamian myths provide the keys to understanding the world of the 4th millennium BCE. And compared to later periods, the 4th millennium was a relatively peaceful time during which political power was diffused. Naturally, there were occasional threats to the peace and even military confrontations, but this was not the norm. Sumer was ruled by an ad hoc, crisis-determined assembly which met at Nippur and conferred offices for the duration of the occasional emergencies. So gradually, all of this changed during the 3rd millennium BCE. Conditions then were more accurately reflected in the surviving epics rather than in the myths. War became the common condition. The temporary rulers of the broadly based crisis assemblies of the 4th millennium were replaced by more permanent rulers who were needed for their societies to build massive city walls, erect large public buildings for the administration of the bureaucracy, and to raise standing armies to guard the city and defend it. And in the 3rd millennium, popular assemblies faded into the background, and in their place royal rule developed and was institutionalized. Gradually, these new kings extended their rule over increasingly vast areas. And it's in this setting that the religious concepts of the 4th and the 3rd millennium differed widely. One way to understand the central religious concern of each period is to ask what the central fear of the age was. The 4th millennium was characterized by a relatively primitive economy. It was the fear of famine, of not having enough food. In the 3rd millennium, it was the fear of war, somebody trying to take what you have by invasion. And this social setting had major implications for the development of religious consciousness in both periods. In the 4th millennium, the attitude toward the divine was one of awe, at first perceiving the will behind the natural phenomenon. And the gods were seen as kings and lords of their city. They were guarding it against attack from without and against corruption from within. And in the 4th millennium, worship centered on the numerous powers that dwelt in natural phenomena and were vital to human survival. These powers were experienced as intransitive. They weren't reaching beyond the phenomena in which they were perceived, because there was a variety of natural phenomena. Religion took a pluralistic, polyistic form. There was a god for every rock and tree and river. The cult revolved around ways to ensure the presence and the protection of powers beneficial to the early economies and the absence of harmful ones. So various families of Sumerian gods corresponded to the ecological conditions prevalent in their home areas. There were, for example, gods of the marsh, gods of the pasture land, gods of the desert, and so on. And now, like the god of the marsh, that's significant because it's where Enki, Ea, came in. He was from the great Abzu, the underground sea, and he would go boating in his boat with his boatsmen, manning the oar through the marsh, and it was the serpent's marsh, because it was filled with the backwater water serpents. And that marsh eventually became known as Enki Ea, Ea's den, which we later find a variation of that word. Ea's den became Ea-den or Eden. And so by the 3rd millennium, the human metaphor for the gods had become predominant. The gods were seen as rulers rather than as natural phenomena themselves. The divine was more often conceptualized in anthropomorphic terms as super ruler. So rather than the gods just being these natural phenomena of light, of dark, of lightning, of rain, of desert, of marshland, of river and water, and fire, gods then became rulers rather than the natural phenomena. They had that. This is Mesopotamian religion. The gods became personas that ruled over everything, not just natural phenomena themselves. And so the change was gradual rather than abrupt. Beginning in the early dynastic period, the end of the 4th millennium, the human forms of the divine began to recede, becoming emblems, and even at times enemies of the newest anthropomorphic god. The Sumerian cult of Dumuzi typifies Mesopotamian religion in the 4th millennium. Both the religious metaphors that define it and the social and political conditions to which it relates. Dumuzi, basically an intransitive figure, the elan, vital in nature. Indeed, originally there were several distinct Dumuzi figures. Dumuzi of the date palm, Dumuzi of the shepherds, Dumuzi of the grain, and the allied figure of Damu, the power in the rising sap. And as economies grew more complex, several of these distinct manifestations of Dumuzi, characteristic of the early economies, were all amalgamated and became a singular type of a god. Now, literary texts dealing with Dumuzi are relatively abundant. They focus on the great cycle of the year. In some texts, the passing of the fertile spring into the hot, dry summer is represented by Dumuzi's death. Other texts relating to Dumuzi's death include simple laments by Dumuzi's wife, his mother, his sisters. Myths describe the search for the lost Dumuzi, a search that ultimately proves successful. He is found. And other texts have a ritual background. They describe the courtship and marriage of Dumuzi. In the sacred marriage, Dumuzi, the power for fertility and yield, is married to Inanna, who represents the power of the storehouse. The powers of nature are thus humanized in order to satisfy the need for a meaningful relationship with these often uncontrollable powers. See how that worked? And so in the complex tale of Inanna's descent, Inanna is trapped in the netherworld. The forces imprisoning Inanna agree to release her on the condition that she provide a substitute. In her anger that Dumuzi has not mourned her death, she names Dumuzi, thus dooming him to the netherworld. And so Inanna is revived and Dumuzi is doomed in the netherworld in her stead. Ultimately, Dumuzi is rescued for half of each year by his sister descent to the netherworld in his place. And Jacobson, who wrote this book, explains this involved story as a mythic perception of the relationship between the food in the storehouses and the plants and animals killed to provide the food. And the revival, the replenishing of community storehouses, is at the expense of the living plants and animals, represented by Dumuzi, which must be killed every year to replenish the stores. So the Dumuzi cult was not confined to the 4th millennium. Much of the literary evidence by which we construct the Dumuzi cult is considerably later than the 4th millennium, but there's enough evidence to reflect its 4th millennium origins, including the great Uruk vase, dating to that period, which depicts the sacred marriage between Dumuzi and Inanna. Now remember Uruk? Remember the city of Uruk, or now the region of Uruk? This is the place where Cain, when he left the Garden of Eden, fled east to the land of Nod, and there he built a city and named it after his son, Uruk. Well, Enoch, it says in the Bible, but Enoch, in literal linguistic construction over time, Enoch came to mean the same word as Uruk. It became the word Uruk. And Uruk, of course, is the base word for Iraq, and the base word for the city of Uruk. So Dumuzi himself survived, however, even into the 1st millennium under the name Tammuz. In one of Ezekiel's visions in the Bible, the prophet sees the women of Jerusalem, and even at the gateway of the Lord's temple, sitting and waiting for the death of Tammuz. That you'll find in Ezekiel 8:14. Now, not much differently than the woman of Sumer wailed 2,500 years earlier for the death and resurrection of Tammuz. So if the threatening power of nature was the dominant concern of the 4th millennium, the threatening power of man was the dominant concern of the 3rd millennium. And the archaeological record reveals that wars and military raids became commonplace. City walls were built for protection. Cities grew in size and number as more people sought refuge behind their walls. And this development transformed the dominant political system of the 3rd millennium. No longer were temporary emergency leaders adequate. Permanence was needed in the wake of permanent emergency. And war and victory were the overriding subjects of contemporary thought at that time and became important topics in their art. Epic tales celebrated the new rulers, giving man, as represented by the ruler, a prominence to rival the gods. And so we're going to pick this up, this thought. We're going to talk more about this. To me, and I hope it is to you as well, this is really interesting material and necessary material to understand when you start dissecting how it is the biblical religions came to be. They are evolved from these earlier cultures in Mesopotamia. We're going to come back in 2 minutes. We're going to take a look at this some more. So put your thinking caps on, keep them on tight, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes.
you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You are listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. You're also watching the video simulcast of this show over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. At the same time, while you're there, hopefully you're participating in the live chat room, which is going on right now. Just go on over there. You don't even have to talk if you don't want to enjoy what's going on over in the chat room. You can observe it. But if you would like to, you can join that chat room and join the conversation going on tonight. And by the way, folks, if you want to find some good goods to wear, go over to my to my Etsy page. That's etsy.com/shop/sonofapatriot. It started as a place where I was putting up all these patriotic kinds of t-shirt designs, t-shirts and hoodies and things like that. And then it worked its way into all different kinds of things. I basically take a lot of the topics that we talk about on this show and do shirt designs that are cool, hopefully cool enough to wear. And there are some of you that have just about every shirt and tee and hoodie that I've put together. And there's others of you that have availed yourself of it. So, you know what, folks? If you like what you see over there, go to my shop, etsy.com/shop/sonofapatriot. And you're going to see all my stuff. And go ahead and get yourself a good t-shirt to wear. Or a hoodie, since winter is now coming, as you can tell by the way I'm dressed today. It has gone from, we had, I think, what we call our Indian summer already, at the beginning of October. And it shot up into the 80s earlier in the week. Oh, wait, was it Friday or Saturday? And now we're getting highs in the 40s. And it's probably just going to decline into winter now, as far as we've lost our mild streak. So as we go into winter, we're going to have some interesting topics on this show for you, too. Hopefully things that will want you to curl up by the fire and listen to a good story right here on my channel and on this show. So we left off in the first portion with talking about how in the 4th and the 3rd century, or millennias, BCE in Mesopotamia, how they basically came about creating their gods and creating their religions. Now, this is not to say, I cannot put my foot out there and say that God does not exist or gods do not exist. There were supernatural activities as well as metaphysical activities. But when you look at it from an historical point of view, sometimes anthropologists and archaeologists and historians whitewash spirituality a little bit too much. They'll look at the religion and how religion affected humanity, but they won't look at the spirituality and say maybe there was something to this. And so the same thing with the God of the Bible. If the God of the Bible, in biblical form as we know him, the Jehovah, the Yahweh, the Elohim, if these all exist, but there is proof that they really evolved out of older religions, well then who is God really? Is the question this makes you want to ask. Who is God? Is he a God of thunder? Is he a God of the rainfall? Is he a God of crops? Is he a God of war? Is he a God of wrath? Are all these attributes of a singular God? These things all existed prior to the Jehovah God of the Old Testament. But also remember that first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That was a statement that recognized the fact that there were other gods to put your faith in. So some of them false, some of them real. So this is what the situation we have brewing. But that the God that we worship out of the Old Testament, in the Bible, and eventually the New Testament, were gods that evolved from older religions. Remember, war and victory we left off with were the overriding subjects of contemporary thought in the 3rd century BCE, 3rd millennia BCE. And that contemporary thought became important topics in all their art. Epic tales grew out of these. The tale of Atrahasis, the great flood of Gilgamesh. All of these epic tales grew from that, giving man, as represented by the ruler, a prominence to rival the gods. Now, conversely, the new idea of ruler, remember they only ruled by emergency in the 4th millennium BC, overall speaking. It wasn't until the 3rd millennium that he had evolved into creating dynasties and rulers. So the new idea of ruler, drawn from the then corrupt political situation, was used to suggest the divine aspects of majesty and energy. And the metaphor of God as ruler appropriately expressed the power of the gods and the earthly setting in which mankind experienced this power. And in the 3rd millennium, important gods became understood as manorial lords of their temple estates. Like their earthly counterparts, such estates were focused and focal points of economic activity. They had large staffs of lesser gods, as well as human workers. Like earthly rulers, the divine lords provided protection against the external enemies and administered justice within their realms. And this new ruler, by the way, you can even see it in the way it's watered down to our republic in the United States. Now, I know lots of you who are listening are not citizens of the United States, and you're listening from other countries. But in the United States, that's what we have. We have a federal government that represents really that the divine lord of the land, if you will, that provides protection against external enemies and administers justice. But they have all the sub-gods, if you will, the states, local governments, local courts, local administrators, local legislators that have to do with all the different regions and all the other laws of the land. So this new ruler metaphor, this God metaphor, also provided a new perspective on the universe. Everything around us, the whole cosmos, became understood in terms of political organization. Each god had a role to play in this political entity, a role granted by the assembly of all the gods. In the 4th millennium BCE, the gods' immanence in natural phenomena had been perceived as an expression of their innate nature. In the 3rd millennium, the gods assumed the roles and the duties given them by the assembly of the gods, an essentially political body. This assembly of the gods was the highest authority in the universe. It met in Nippur and served as a court that passed sentence on wrongdoers, both human and divine. It elected and deposed kings, human and divine, and would condemn whole cities to destruction. And these gods, now politically conceived, were active shapers of human history. We created them, and now they are what controls us. The 4 most important gods in the 3rd millennium were An, A-N, Enlil, Nahursaga, so it's pronounced, and Enki. Their powers corresponded to the 4 great cosmic elements: air, storms, rocky ground, and flowing fresh water. I want to make sure I pronounce Ninhursaga. Ninhursaga. So, An, Enlil, Ninhursaga, and Enki. And An was the power of the sky, the father of the gods, the procreator of vegetation. He was thus the image of paternal authority, who presided over the assembly of the gods and conferred earthly kingship. Enlil was the god of the moist spring rains and of storms. Enlil was thus the embodiment of energy and force, the executive manager of the gods. Unfortunately, his power was not always beneficent. He could easily unlash fearful storms on man and thus destroy him. Ninhursaga, the female of the supreme triad, was a many-faceted goddess. Originally, she was the power in the stony soil. She was also closely associated with wildlife and herd animals. She's preeminently the birth-giving mother, often under the name Nintur. Jacobson, in his book, suggested that the connection between birth and the rocky ground might be that the birth of herd animals normally occurred in the spring, when the herds were pastured in the stony soil that rings Mesopotamia in the foothills of the Iranian ranges and in the Arabian desert. And his birth giver, Ninhursaga, was the great midwife and the one who gave birth to kings. She didn't, however, develop a political function in the organization of the gods, and therefore she progressively lost rank amongst the gods. She had no political power attributed to her there. Enki, the third rival member of the divine triad, was the power in the sweet waters, in rivers, marshes, and rain. And his was thus the power to fertilize, the power to cleanse. Because water moistens clay before it's shaped, Enki was also the god of artists and of craftsmen, the most cunning of the gods. So powers in the lesser cosmic elements were seen as the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of An. And in the second millennium, we see a critical change in religious orientation. For the first time, a concern for self predominates that which gives rise to personal religion. So the concern for self rose above. And this became then a personal religious orientation. Jacobson is not clear what social and political changes account for the shift, or what new fears provided the impetus, but that religion redirected itself to areas of personal concern, and and that's unquestionable. That's found through anthropology and history. And so in Mesopotamia, their religion of the second millennium, we find the clearest connections with biblical religion. It's when it started becoming the personal religion of people. For example, compare Jacobson's definition of personal religion in second millennium Mesopotamia with Psalms 25 and 38. He describes personal religion as the religious attitude in which the religious individual sees himself standing in close personal relationship to the divine, expecting help, the guidance in his personal life and his personal affairs, expecting anger from the divine and punishment if he sins, but also profoundly trusting to divine compassion, forgiveness, and love for him if he repents. Listen to the psalm. Remember, Lord, remember thy tender care and thy love unfailing, shown from ages past. Do not remember the sins and offenses of my youth, but remember me in thy unfailing love. The Lord is good and upright, therefore he teaches sinners the way they should go. Turn to me and show me thy favor, for I am lonely and oppressed. Relieve the sorrows of my heart, and bring me out of my distress. Look at my misery and my trouble, and forgive my every sin. That was Psalm 25. Then you have Psalm 38. And by the way, in case you don't know this, Book of Psalms in the Old Testament. On thee, O Lord, I fix my hope. Thou wilt answer, O Lord my God. I said, let them never rejoice over me, who exult when my foot slips. I am indeed prone to stumble, and suffering is never far away. I make no secret of my iniquity, and am anxious at the thought of my sin. But, Lord, do not thou forsake me. Keep not far from me, my God. Hasten to my help, O Lord of my salvation. So the attitude reflected in these Psalms is pretty basic to both Judaism and to Christianity. It finds its roots, however, in 2nd millennium Mesopotamia. Now, Jacobson was very careful to note that the typical humility and self-abasement of penitents presuppose a remarkable, almost arrogant feeling of human importance. We believe that we matter to God. Imagine that. That is the keystone, the cornerstone to Christianity now, is that we matter to God. And that what we do is important to Him. That God cares about us and cares about our deeds, our sins, our repentance, our salvation. So this 2nd millennium concept of God as intimately concerned with the daily affairs of the individual is a radically different religious perspective from the awestruck perception of the mystery of natural phenomena, which characterized 4th and 3rd millennium religion. So in the 2nd millennium, God is brought from those phenomenal things, the God of the mountain, the God of the stars, the God of the hail, the God of fire and water. He's brought from those concepts of the organized universe of the 4th and 3rd millennia and to a close personal world of the individual, who for the moment ignores the holiness and awesomeness of the maker of the universe. But man cannot long ignore the non-personal aspect of God. Psalm 8 is a classic statement. It says, when I look up at thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars set in their place by thee, what is man that thou shouldst remember him? Mortal man that thou shouldst care for him. So the coexistence of these two aspects of God is a basic paradox. It's an historical paradox. It's a religious paradox. The worshiper is overwhelmed by God's majesty and holiness, and yet at the same time, he approaches God on a very personal level, appealing to God for his personal salvation. You get that? The worshiper, the individual, us, we're overwhelmed by the majesty of God and his holiness, and yet he's the approachable Abba, Father, the Daddy in the Aramaic in the New Testament, the Daddy God, on a very personal level. And so the origins of these conflicting attitudes are found in Mesopotamia, where the concept of personal religion originated. For example, listen to this. This is an ancient Mesopotamian prayer. It says this: I have cried to thee, thy suffering, wearied, distressed servant. See me, O my lady, accept my prayers. Faithfully look upon me and hear my supplication. Say, a pity about me, and let thy mood be eased. A pity about my wretched body, that is full of disorders and troubles. A pity about my sore heart, which is full of tears and sobbings. So texts reflecting this attitude toward personal religion appear early in Mesopotamia, toward the beginning of the 2nd millennium. And there are no examples elsewhere in the Near East until half a millennium later. And so it seems clear that the concept of personal religion spread from Mesopotamia to down into Israel and Egypt. And although we don't know how this occurred or the paths it took. And by Israel, I mean what is now Israel. Of course, you could call it Palestine. It was Canaan, the Canaanite region. So in Mesopotamia, however, the concept of a personal God was not perceived as contradictory to the idea of divine holiness and majesty, because God's personal aspect was reflected in personal gods rather than cosmic gods. In Mesopotamia, an individual worshipped his personal god or his goddess, as well as the great national gods with their cosmic offices, as individuals' personal god was in many ways a personification of the power for the personal success in that individual. And when one attained luck or good fortune, one acquired a god. The god inspired the individual to act and generally lent success to his plans. The personal god was the divine parent of the individual who cared for him as a mother and a father. He provided for his children, protected them, and interceded on their behalf with the higher powers. The god dwelt within the man's body, was present even at the act of conception, and thus in a way engendered his children, who accordingly held the same personal God throughout the generations. Man dwelt in the protective shadow of his God. If the God got angry at the individual, however, he would leave, and with him went the individual's power to succeed. Man therefore placated his personal God and induced him into return by penitence, penitential prayers, the humility of penitence, and the assurance of the God's concern. And this is logical in the context of a personal God. Imagine how you would feel if you are indoctrinated, I use that word in a neutral sense, not a negative one, into the religion that you believe and worship the God you worship. What if that God wasn't there? What if you didn't have that? You would feel cast adrift. You're alone in an endless, decaying universe. And so the need for that personal God existed. And this is why that developed. Perhaps there was a God of the thunder and of the mountain, but they had to personally bring that God in to make the life worth living, to humanize, to bring life to the human. So in Mesopotamian religion, this idea of the personal God as parent, remember, I already mentioned it once, in the New Testament, Jesus talks about calling upon God as Abba, Father, which is Aramaic. Abba is a word for dada, papa, daddy. Jesus was saying, look at God as your daddy, as your papa, and a personalized God. So this idea of the personal God as parent served as a psychological bridge to the many gods' awesome powers. But even the great cosmic powers could be personal gods, although only of great men and royalty, not the average person. These great cosmic gods, too, had loving concern for their children. All gods could thus be viewed as concerned and approachable, as the parents of man. A familiar filial attitude toward all the gods began to permeate religion, resulting in the general attitude called personal religion. Now, another paradox familiar to the student of the Bible, which can also be found in Mesopotamian religion of the second millennium, is this paradox of the righteous sufferer. He finds himself in trouble despite his blamelessness. This problem is dealt with in two notable Babylonian works. The so-called Babylonian Job, remember the story of Job in the Old Testament, which, by the way, is the earliest chronological book in the Old Testament. It's the oldest book in the Bible, and it's pre-Jehovah worship. It's pre-Judaism, even though I think he called upon God as Elohim in there. But the so-called Babylonian Job, I will praise the Lord of wisdom, it's called. And the Babylonian Theodicee, Theodicy, I hate that word because I always want to say it backward. Theodicy. Neither of these compositions can provide the answer to a problem that's essentially unresolvable. Why a blameless person could also have trouble. I've seen modern books written by, I think it was James Dobson, Focus on the Family, 20 years ago or more. It came out with the book, Why Do Good People Suffer? Something like that was the title. And it's a question we ask. So Jacobson points out in his book, however, in the Babylonian Job, for the first time, the personal egocentric view of the righteous sufferer is rejected. The Babylonian Job is overwhelmed. He realizes how great the distance is between God in his cosmic majesty and individual man in his littleness. In this context, man cannot demand justice. This realization does not, however, result in the rejection of personal religion. With the help of the concepts of personal religion, man has become the son of God and can confront him on an intimate level. Have you noticed that these ancient gods that were in control of the universe, and in Judaism and Christianity, we have the personal God, the God who created all, out of which everything exists and subsists and is held together, the God who created all from nothingness, the great cosmic power, is also the Abba, Father, the one who would consult you or console you when you called out to him, the one who knew your name, the one who, according to the book of Psalms, has the very hairs of your head numbered. There's the same God who a sparrow does not fall, but he knows its name. So, a number of major Mesopotamian religious works developing the concept of personal religion were produced in the 2nd millennium BCE. The Atrahasis story, which I made reference to already, the Enuma Elish, and the Gilgamesh epic. According to Jacobson, all are existential critiques of the universe. That is, each of them deals in a sophisticated way with basic questions of existence and the nature of the universe. The Atrahasis story focuses on the destructive capacity of the power of the gods. Atrahasis' response to this power is that man should increase his devotion to the gods and take care not to disturb them. And you know, there's so much. I want to go into the Enuma Elish. I want to go into the Gilgamesh story, but these things, there's a lot more to this than we have time left on the clock for tonight. And so we're gonna wrap it up there. And we're going to pick this up tomorrow night. We're going to talk about the Enuma Elish. We're going to talk about Atrahasis' story. We're going to talk about how there are multiple truths at the basis of the myths that we find in the Bible. By biblical mythology, I mean. And we're also, if we get to it, we're going to talk about how the serpent became Satan. That might be a couple of days out yet. That might be Friday's show. So you guys all sit tuned. There's more of this to come. We're going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be right back. You have a good night. Thank you for being here.